let's talk a little bit about the grid layout in the web. And I think it's kind of the holy grail of web layout, because we had a lot prior, but the grid layout is a really, really good method to creating a layout. So in these videos, I will try to make them rather short, but when you see something like this, I think it is a good idea to stop the video and then try to do what's stipulated in the slide. And then you can use your tries or your knowledge before you continue. Because if you do that, you will learn so much better. So if you're in a hurry, then maybe you can actually skip to the next video, because I will just start with a little bit of the background for the grid. It is good for the understanding, but if you really would like to dig into the coding, well, then you can continue. So the grid layout is then currently the newest layout method for the grid. It took approximately 25 years or so before it arrived. That might feel strange, but there was a lot of development before this one. And the idea is that we have a two-dimensional layout that kind of actually works. Because prior we had float, and that was kind of a hack. Then we had also the flexbox arrived later on. That is also a good method, and I use it a lot, but it is mainly a one-dimensional layout. So in the grid layout, on the other hand, you can place elements in your 2D grid, and you can either let the browser place all your elements, or you can place them explicitly. So what is the idea then? Well, the idea is that you have some kind of grid system, and then in that grid you place your elements, and you can do that in, as I said, any way you want. And what is the advantage then with the grid? Well, if we compare to float, except from that float is just a hack, well, using floats you usually need extra wrappers to get the layout that you really want. So here, for example, we would need an extra wrapper, because here we should have elements on top of each other, and then we also need to clear the floats usually to ensure that the footer goes below in this case. So you need some extra stuff here. If we compare to a flexbox, well, a flexbox, you can use flexbox for a layout, but as I said, it is a two-dimensional layout, so you need extra wrappers for those. So you need a wrapper for the main part of the site here, because the main layout should be from top to bottom. So that means a flexbox with a column layout. And then, of course, within that main part, you need another wrapper to have, again, a column layout for the two left parts here. So if we compare this with the grid, well, you don't need any extra wrappers. You need one grid element, that is the container element, that is needed. And maybe you could say that that is not needed using float, but I still think this is a better method. So you can easily rearrange the placement of your elements when you switch from one screen size to another. So you can easily fix your layout in a good way depending on the screen width or the screen size. And you can actually rearrange, because the grid, you can place the items in a different way than what you have in the HTML code. So you can use that to your advantage if you would like to reshuffle when you go to the mobile, for example. Or maybe you would like to have the main part early in the HTML file to get a little bit better SEO. But then on the site, maybe you would like to have the sidebar to the left, and then you can just put them there within the grid. So what is the terminology in the grid? Well, it is kind of similar to a flexbox, because you have a container, and here you have a grid container instead of a flexbox container, and then you have the grid items, and the items are the direct child of the container element. So we also have a little bit other terminology. We are talking about a grid cell, and that is one cell in the grid. If you have something that spans more than one cell, well, that is called a grid area. So that is one or more adjacent cells. So then we also talk about grid lines, and those are usually invisible, but you have your imaginary lines between each cell in the grid. And we also talk about grid track, and that is a distance from one line to another line. And here I have equal distance. You don't need to have that when designing a grid. You can set up any system that we will see later on. We also have two axes, the same as in the flexbox, but in the grid we call them inline axis and the block axis. And one advantage that makes the grid easier is that the inline axis is always horizontal and goes from left to the right, and the block axis is always vertical and goes from top to bottom. So the grid axis doesn't swap as they do in, or they can do in the flexbox. There are some other similarities compared to flexbox if you use that one. Well, you have attributes is set in the container, and you have attributes that you set on the children. But of course you use the grid template stuff, for example, instead of flexbox items. But you kind of work in a similar way. You have some attributes that belongs to the container and some attributes that belongs to the grid items. You also can use the same version of justify content, line content, and line items that you have in the flexbox. But again, remember that the grid always have the same directions. So there is kind of nothing that confuses you when you set justify content to start, for example. And here you set it to just start and not flex anything, like with flex in the beginning, I should say. They also have their line self, but then we have some more for the grid. The grid also have the place content, and we have justify items and place items for the container, and then also justify self and place self for the grid items. And the place is actually a compound format where you can, it's the same as using both justify and align in one go. So to recap a little bit, we have cell, that is one square in the grid, area, one or more adjacent cells, and line is the probably imaginary line between the cells, and then we have a track, that is the distance between the two cells. Then you also can add a gap, as you can in the flexbox, that will add spaces between your cells in that way. But this is the base for the grid, and now we can continue and do a little bit of work with this one also.